Hi everyone, welcome to the first video of our imposed, what is it called, social distancing. Made all those jokes that I made about the coronavirus towards the beginning of the semester, makes them a lot less funny. Here we are now. So I'm going to make one of these videos, I think for these shorter readings that we do from the reader. I think that I'll do one video per reading, and I'll answer the questions and probably have a go at a little bit of a wider explanation here. What we lose probably is in interaction that we have in class, which I think is great. But I guess what we gain is me talking incessantly for 20 minutes at least, I would think. So let's have a look at the questions. First of all, I want to sort of point out some irony. Before I started making this video, I changed my shirt, and so if you read more semi-closely, you'll see why that's ironic. I had a nice flannel shirt on, fairly informal, fairly casual shirt on. I changed it for a slightly less casual shirt, right? Which, if we were in Utopia, I would only have one cloak. And it would be all made of wool, undyed wool, and the quality of the thread wouldn't bother us, and all of that. So let's get into some of the questions that you've asked here. So I've picked, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions here to work through, and I'll discuss them myself, I suppose, and then hopefully that'll be of some value to you as you come to do an exam. The exam, just before we get into the questions, just a reminder to you that the exam is going to go ahead as scheduled, except that we won't be coming to the classroom. We'll be doing it online. There's a video in the announcements that I sent out to everybody that explains how we'll do that. We'll do that with RP Now. There are some instructions that I put up there today about how to use RP Now. And if I haven't already done this, which I may have done, but if I haven't already done, I'm going to pop up a practice test there so that you can get used to using RP Now. There'll be no, I'm not going to repeat the stuff that I put on the other video, so have a look at that. So Utopia, Thomas More. I noticed that a lot of the questions had to do with this idea of money. Money is definitely a part of what he's writing about here, but it's I think not the main part even. Maybe it's our main part. But, I think the way I like to read it, especially the selection that we have in the reader, is it's almost about luxury more than anything, and it's almost about communism. Communism. Remember, when I say communism, what I'm talking about is that last stage in that Marx's sort of stages of revolution. That go through revolution, the immiseration of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then the withering away of the state, and the installation of a state of communism, where, and if we look at Utopia, we see probably what we see is something that maybe Marx would identify with a sort of a communist state, and let's talk a little bit about that, why that might be. Obviously, bearing in mind that here we're talking about more 300 years before communism, before the Communist Manifesto that we'll read also this week, 300 years before then. So he's got the jump there on Marx. Anyway, so I'm going to do this first question then in the light of that. Would the same incentives that are common throughout capitalism exist within Utopia? Do both have a similar set of incentives or different? Which one works best for the average man? And this question reminds me of the scene in Utopia where those foreign diplomats come, those foreign ambassadors come, and they're all adorned in their multicolored robes. I think they're multicolored capes and whatnot. I think I'm forgetting the actual word that Moore uses, the item of clothing, but they're dressed in fine clothing. What you and I would see as fine clothing. They have those gold chains. They have gold dangling from their ears. And the reason why these ambassadors have done this is because they want to impress on the Utopians how important they are. But what happens when they get there is the kids make fun of the ambassadors, right? Because in Utopia, those sorts of adornments, the chains, right? Chains are only for slaves. And so if you're wearing any sort of gold chain, then you look like you might be a slave. The pearls and sort of fancy jewels and things. That's the stuff that parents give to their kids when they're little to play with, you know, trinkets. Uh, Moore says it like, he says, you know, when our children grow up, right, when our children in England, right, in the real world, I suppose, right, as opposed to Utopia, when they grow up, they give away their dolls and they give up their rattles, not because their parents forbid them to play with them, but just because they get ashamed, right? They grow up and say, I'm too big to play with a rattle. I don't want to play with that anymore. In Utopia, Moore says that's how people are with pearls. Right? They don't even go out looking for pearls, but they might find them when they're doing something else, and oh, there's a nice pearl. Might pick it up and sort of cut it a little bit and give it to their little child, you know, to play with and to maybe to wear to feel special. But children, they grow up and they get embarrassed of those things and they cast them away because they're valueless. And this is sort of the direction I'm coming at in terms of incentives, because incentives, they have to have some value to the, you know, in order for them to be incentives, right? They have to have some sort of value to people. And I think a lot of what Moore's getting at here is, you know, what the problem he sees in actual society, right, in real society, the one like he's living in England, the problem that he sees is like we put our value in the wrong place. Right? The people who earn the most money are the most useless people, right? The people involved in the most useless of occupations, he thinks, right? So he sees, I suppose, first of all, he sees a great division, a great inequality, right? We would talk about some very rich people and some very poor people, but Moore sees the very rich in society are those people who are probably the least useful, who are involved in the least useful occupations. And the poorer ones, they're the ones who are doing the things that we need. And he has a list in there. What does he say? Something like miners are in there. Iron rights, you know, people making stuff that we need to live our daily life. And he says, you know, these people who are making the things that we need for our daily life, those guys are living a poor, miserable life. And the people who are, you know, the jewelers, I think, is one of the people he picks on, right? Who are making these ridiculous gold chains, right? Fancy gold chains that made the ambassadors in Utopia look like children, look like slaves or children, look like figures of fun, where the kids are pointing at them and saying, "Look at that big ninny wearing that big chain of pearls." Like, what? You know, didn't he never grow up, right? And then his parents says, you know, stop mocking the poor ambassador, dear. So Moore sort of wants to point at that contradiction that he sees in real society, that those who are doing the least important jobs are making the most money. Those who are doing the most important jobs are living miserably. And he sort of wants to reverse that in Utopia. So I don't know, for me, I think in terms of this, you know, do both have a similar sense of incentives? I think we'd have to say no, right? We'd have to say that they don't work like that in Utopia for some reason. Now we can go into a question and sort of say and expand on that and say, well, you know, could Utopia really exist? Right? Could there really be a set of people who really would laugh at the guy in the crimson robe with the pearls? And you know, remember when we talked about conservatism? Remember when we talked about the coronation of the Queen? And we talked about the sort of the glory, the accoutrements, right? That made the Queen somehow more than man. At least that's sort of the idea of somebody like de Maistre or somebody like that, a conservative or a reactionary. That's anointed by God, right? That's a special oil on them, right? Of course, that might be. I guess for conservatives, we naturally are in awe of that sort of thing. These great gold chains and the earrings and the crimson robes, right? We might be in awe of those sorts of things naturally. Maybe that's what maybe de Maistre would say. But Moore's pointing to that, and he's saying. That seems like it could be in a sensible society. That could be ridiculous. We might look at that and think that's childish. Yeah, of course. I think somebody mentioned that, you know, the Catholic Church there, which of course would be in Moore's day, right? Would be very wealthy, right, and would be very, very much sort of aligned with this very wealthy, very rich. The robes, rich, bright, scarlet, golden robes, and that sort of thing. Would be impressive, right, and would be taken as impressive. I'll say. And so then the question is like, could it ever be that that's not impressive, right? That looks silly. And I think that would be sort of a very anti-conservative argument, and it's one that I think more is making. But which one works best for the average man? So the average man in Utopia, I think. But the question I think that I would ask there is like, is the average man in Utopia, is that realistic, right? Are we not all bound to be awed by the gold and the multicolored clothing? I think they've all got one robe or something in Utopia, because what's the point, right? They're all the same color anyway, right? Moore says, in other places outside of Utopia, right, in the real world, even fashionable men will have 10. 10 won't be enough different cloaks. That's the word, cloaks. Different cloaks with different colors and that sort of thing. That won't even be enough to us. So again, the question is about what is sought after, and he wants us to consider that and ask ourselves whether the sought after thing is really a natural thing to seek after, or whether it's a little bit peculiar. And it's starting to sort of, again, it's making me come back to this idea of communism, because one of the results of Utopia, one of the results of not going after the jewels, right, and the luxury, he calls them false pleasures. These things that purport to bring us pleasure and joy, but really they don't. Like, really they don't bring us anything of the sort. It doesn't help us to have those clothes and those jewels, right? The fine twined linen or something, right? It doesn't really help us, and it doesn't really make us happy to have those things, he says. And he says, and if we got rid of that, if we got rid of all that, actually the time that it would take people to make the things that we do need in our lives, the things that we do need, that we need to help to make our life go on. Again, he's got miners and ironwrights and those sorts of things. He does one, you'll have read, right? He compares like iron to gold. So, why do we think the gold's worth more than iron? Iron's way more useful than gold. And of course, we say, we're stupid to say that gold is rarer, so it's more valuable, but it's not nowhere near as useful as iron. And that could be a metaphor for his whole argument, I think, right? He's saying, look, why is gold more expensive than iron when iron is much more useful? And he's saying that about classes of people too, right? Why are the people that are involved in the menial, necessary everyday tasks, why are they valued less than these people who are involved in tasks and occupations that bring us these things that purport to make us happy, but really don't anyway, right? They're really useless things. Don't even do the thing that they're supposed to do. So, but the idea is, if we just focus on the needful things, the things that will bring us happiness, real happiness in our life, that stuff we could produce much more quickly in much less time. And if we were all involved in that, if we got rid of the useless professions, and we just focused on the things that we needed, then we'd only be working a few hours, right? And so we'd have more time to devote to whatever we wanted to do. We wouldn't have to work in necessary professions, right? Necessary jobs. We could, and then that reminds me of Marx, right, where he talks about writing poetry, okay, which we talked about already a little bit. Okay, so let's move on. The book says that the utopia virtue is having everything owned in common, but in abundance as well. Isn't a utopia almost like the fountain of youth strived for, but not an actual obtainable goal? Of course, the name of it, right? It says Utopia, right? Dr. Ball thinks it's a play on, and it might well be, right? A play on this idea of either no place, from the sort of utopia or evtopia, like a good place, right? So good place or no place. And so there's room for like understanding this as a, hey, this could never exist, and there's room for, hey, this is the best place that we could imagine. And of course, both of those things could be true at the same time. But why is it a virtue to have everything on in common, but in abundance as well? So I hear the question saying this is not likely, right? This is impossible, maybe, or isn't it? Is sort of the implication of the question, not an actual obtainable goal. And I think it does depend on what you think of as human nature. You know, if you're a conservative that thinks that we are naturally or in awe of sumptuous wealth and fine clothes and jewelry. I keep picking on that because that's what Moore is talking about. Then yeah, maybe it's unobtainable. The way that Moore thinks we would obtain this, I suppose, is one, to realize the ridiculousness of the unnecessary occupations, but also the point, and this is the part that sort of rings, it sort of strikes a chord with me, right? This idea that if we limited our consumption, right, if we limited our consumption to things that were really useful to us, really necessary to us, and bring us a little bit of happiness, then we would be working less. It's striking to me, for example, that like the amount of automation that has occurred, right, certainly since, well, absolutely since Moore was writing, but even in the last 50 years, right, or 70 years. The amount of automation, the labor-saving devices at home, but also, I mean, the factory, the mass production, the way we produce things now. All those advances, and yet we're still working, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, who knows how many hours a week. And so there's a sort of a question of, like, the more we produce, the more we seem to need to produce, right? The more efficient our industry gets, the more we produce, but we just, the bigger our demand gets for the extra things as well. When you think about the amount of things and the types of things and the expense of things that we own and take for granted now, I think I'm thinking mostly about electronics. I'm sitting here in my home talking to you through a camera that when I was a kid I could never, my family could never have had anything like this, right? But the more efficient we are at producing things, the more we demand, right? The more we want. And so it does seem to me that more sort of fighting against that, and in order for that to be possible, there'd have to be quite a change in the way that we see life and consumption. One that doesn't seem to be happening, even with the increased efficiency. So, I think that's a fair question. It makes me think a little bit of Marx, right, where he says our nature has been perverted by the capitalist system, right? I mean, if we take that on, if we believe Marx in that, and we might say that, well, capitalism makes us consume, right? It needs us to consume, and so it has ways of, maybe through the ideological superstructure, advertising and that sort of thing, marketing, to make us consume the things that we don't really need for a happy and successful life. But that's definitely what Moore wants us to think about. What sort of things are we setting our hearts on, and what sort of things are impressive, and what do we wish for, and if we didn't, would a better life be possible? I definitely see that in what Moore's forwarding there. I like this one. Could the Utopia society be compared to the state of nature, due to Moore saying that few rules are sufficient to function? I like the idea, and I like the reference to the state of nature. I think that's a nicely thought out question. It seems very different from Moore's state of nature, right? Owning everything in common. Well, I suppose if you own everything in common, it's not quite the state. It's not. Whenever I think of state of nature, I think more of Hobbes than I think of Locke. That's just because I think I don't know. I just enjoy Hobbes a little bit more, but. With Hobbes, right, it's a state of nature is a war of all against all, and we all sort of have a right to everything. That's not the same as common ownership, of course, but it sort of rhymes in some ways. It's almost like it's mirror opposite or something, right? In Hobbes' state of nature, we all have a right to everything. And if we have common ownership, we kind of own everything together. But in a Hobbes of state nature, we might fight a little bit more over that stuff. Whereas if in Utopia, there seems to be some sort of an agreement that we share these things and we own it in common, right? And there seems to be certainly more peace involved there, right? But that's not exactly the question, because you're focusing on the few rules. And I was interested in what Moore had to say about laws, because he said, okay, even with this private ownership that we have outside of Utopia, right, where we insist on private ownership of our property, in there, he says even then we can't really keep our possessions, right, because of all these lawsuits, right, and the more laws that we add to try and secure the possession of our goods, the more lawsuits that come, the less easily we hang on to them. So I think he thinks that there's some sort of a, of course, in Utopia, I suppose if there's less of these luxury goods, maybe, there's no point in taking anybody else's cloak, because everybody's got one cloak and they're all the same, right? So what's the point in going to court and trying to get that from him? And that would go for, there's no point getting the jewels, right? Because jewels are for kids, right? And nobody even wants them over the age of 10. So it seems like it comes back to that again, that desire and where our hearts are, what we want, what we think is the right material to own. So I think that's why there's fewer rules in Utopia. There's fewer laws, because maybe there's not as much greed, maybe, or as much covetousness, right? We don't want what they've got because we've got the same thing anyway. We've already got it, and that might be. Again, that's not quite an answer. I think I've talked a little bit about the state of nature. I've talked a little bit about why there's so few rules, and I do like the question, because I think that's an interesting thing to think about, to compare. And as I said before, right, the war versus peace, right? It seems like Utopia is much more peaceful. And it does seem like human nature is a little bit different in Utopia, because, in Hobbes' state of nature, at least, there does seem to be we do seem to extend our reach beyond our grasp as human beings, right, for Hobbes. Whereas Utopia, there seems to be a contentment where we say, no, I don't need that, right? That's not for me. So that would be a bit of a difference there. But also the few rules as well, that would, like you said, well, I think we've already said that, so. Could you say that Utopia encompasses a sense of communism, since they believe money is the standard? There's a couple about money is the standard, and he says something along those lines early on, right? But he's not necessarily talking about Utopia there, is he, right? He's talking about in current society. It's a critique that he's making. Let's see if I can find it, since I've got it open here. He says at the beginning, right, he's got, I guess his main character, Hythloday, is saying to Master Moore, he's saying that whenever men have private property and money is the measure of everything, there it is hardly possible for the Commonwealth to be justly governed or to flourish in prosperity. So he's talking against that. Moore thinks that's how things are in normal society. I don't think that's how things are in Utopia. But still, nevertheless, I chose the question because I think, yes, communism in particular, as that last stage in development that Marx is predicting, that looks to me like Utopia, right? Because, again, because they have it in abundance, because actually it doesn't take that much to produce the things that we need for a good life, for more. So we don't have to work as hard, so we have a lot more free time to engage in the pursuits that we would naturally want to engage in. That's kind of along the lines of Marx's thinking about communism as well. Absolutely is. And then we'll have that in abundance because it doesn't take much to make it, and so we can make a lot of it, and then we can have a rest at the end of the day. We can have 30-day weeks like the French, right? Or even, 30-hour weeks, or 10-hour weeks, whatever. And still have an abundance because we don't need that much. Let's see, let's go on. So So that's a critique of when money is the measure of everything. He goes on, unless that is, you think that justice is done when all things are in the hands of evil men, or that prosperity and happiness are found when everything is divided among a few. And even those few do not really thrive. And that's the thing, like even those people who have the riches, they're not happy either. Right? That stuff's not the things that's not the stuff that makes you happy for more, right? Because look at the next paragraph, right? It says, this is so different from the wise and godly ordinances of the Utopians, among whom a few laws are sufficient to keep everything well and happily ordered. In Utopia, virtue is greatly esteemed, and even though all things are owned in common, everyone has everything in abundance. Now compare them with the many nations that are always making new but unsatisfactory laws. In these countries, every man claims that he has his own property or private goods, but the new laws they make every day are not enough to enable everyone to enjoy or defend those things he calls his own. That's what we mentioned that earlier. So yeah, Utopia is definitely contrasting with that idea of money being the standard of everything. Yeah. So that's important to know. I'm going to end with this. I like the story he talks about the house, right? This is another thing that, and again, he's sort of contrasting, I think, human natures here. Because he tells us, look, in our world, he doesn't say in our world, but in your countries, a man he inherits a house from his father. This is a good metaphor as well for the sort of thinking of more. He inherits his house from his father, and his father spent a lot of money building this house, right, and furnishing it and getting it how he likes it. And he spent a lot of money on it, and his son inherits the house, and his son looks at the house and he says, I don't like this. I'm going to build myself a new one, right? And so he's always building new, right? He's always, and of course, it takes a lot of labor and a lot of wealth and a lot of effort to build a house, right? I'm imagining one of those country houses in England. It takes an enormous amount of wealth and labor to build that, and some land as well. Right? He's building on a new plot, according to Moore. And so if every new generation has to have something entirely new, if everybody says, okay, I'm bored of that now, I want something new, if we weren't doing that, if we were mending and fixing up the things that we already had, mending our own tunics and that sort of thing, having simple tunics, right, and fixing them when they break, and just having one of them, rather than going out and buying new, the amount of labor, the amount of capital that we would need to always be making new, that would be cut right down. And so then we'd have an abundance of everything that we would need. So that's another, another sort of interesting image, I think, for me. This old house, let's fix up the old house. Let's just have one house instead of, a new house every generation. Because the new house ultimately doesn't make us any more happy, and we don't enjoy it anymore. And we're always making laws to try and keep this, but it never really works for more. So I hope that shed some light. I hope that was interesting as well, that maybe prompted you to go back to the text and to have another look. I hope it answered some of those questions that I'd picked out. I hope that because as the exam's coming on Thursday, all these questions that we've talked about in class, you should think about as sort of potentially arising on the essay question section of the paper, of the exam, of the midterm. And yeah, what else? Just that if I haven't fully answered them, I've given you hopefully a background and a connection between the questions, deep connection between the questions and the readings. All right, I'm going to get this up now.